2018 has been a year full of movies. I've seen almost over 100 films this year, and there have been some films that were bad, some films that were good. But what happens when I watch a bad film that I actually secretly love? Well, we get a guilty pleasures list. I'm changing up the format of how I do my list this year, so we're going to be doing 5 different lists. So we're going to do the guilty pleasures, the meh list, the okay, they're okay list, and then the worst and best lists at the very, very end. In this video is the guilty pleasures, and what do I have for guilty pleasures? 6 movies. Out of over 100 films this year I watched, only 6 were my guilty pleasures. And that's saying something because there's a lot of bad movies in my worst list. So, without further ado, let's get into the first one that I have on this list. Rampage was one of those films that I would consider a guilty pleasure, only for the sole fact that it's pretty much a video game movie. It's not a good video game movie by any standards, but with that third act climax with everything going to shit, having buildings being trampled and destroyed by these giant monsters, it really does feel like it's the video game that the arcade cabinet had given many people back in the 80s. It was a very fun, entertaining film, but I do have to say that Dwayne Johnson keeps putting himself in a lot of his projects, which isn't bad. It keeps his acting career up, but I think his character should have been done by someone else. I think, this whole persona of him just getting in every film he ever produces, I think it's just like wearing down his novelty. If it had been someone else, a different character that could express some of that, it probably would have been a little bit better. But in terms of the film itself, it had a good sense of silliness and goofiness that made it so over the top and fun for me that I just couldn't help but actually kind of like it at the same time. It's not a perfect movie by any means. In fact, none of these movies are perfect. But I do think that this film honestly was one of those films that I could just sit down, relax, and just have some fun times with. There is some funny humor with Jeffrey Dean Morgan in this film, and there's some clever callbacks to the actual video game arcade cabinet. Hell, even the arcade cabinet even shows up in this film, even down to an actual reference to the video game with one of the characters wearing a red dress. I thought that was a really cool factor to be putting into the film. As for visual effects, it's not necessarily the most perfect, but when it comes to the creatures, they're kind of big and menacing like you would expect from a Rampage video game movie. So, yeah, guilty pleasure all around. Not perfect, but it's fun.
Can you close the closet door?
Now, the reason why I put Halloween 2018 on this list is that after seeing it again on home media, I kind of found myself more and more less attracted to this movie. Not so much that the film is bad, but it has some laughable moments. While the film does understand the whole history of Halloween and how to effectively use Michael Myers in a lot of senses, it still feels like an actual Halloween 2 for a lot of things. Like, it does ignore the continuity of the original Halloween 2, and then this one just is like, oh yeah, Jamie Lee Curtis is now Ellen Ripley from Alien 3. Like, I get it. It's not perfect, and I'll give you an example of why this film is so bad it's good. There's a scene in this film where Jamie Lee Curtis's granddaughter is in the film, and and what she does is that she's at this dance, right? And she gets so fed up with a boyfriend of his or some sort of friend, and the phone is just taken away from her, and it's tossed into this like pudding bowl of some sorts, and she doesn't even retrieve it, and she just goes outside. Like, there is some really dumb decisions in this film, and I understand horror movies have some dumb decisions when it comes to their characters. But when I'm looking at the original Halloween, there's not a single point in that film where I'm like, oh yeah, this character's stupid. No, the original Halloween was a basic exercise in home invasion thrillers. It was a very fun, unique sort of slasher film, and it's not necessarily, as iconic as, Nightmare on Elm Street with its protagonist being a bit more expressive in the way he talks and approaches its victims. Michael Myers has always been a classic because of the mystique, the mystery. And I feel like with every single one of these films, they try to do a sort of like, oh yeah, this explains Michael Myers. We don't need an explanation. Like, we don't, for any of these slasher villains, we don't need an explanation. Just leave them as they are. I mean, certain explorations of the character could be nice, but explaining where they came from has always been a kind of a bad thing. And for one thing, I kind of would recommend the Rob Zombie remake over this movie, considering the fact that he actually tries to do something new instead of trying to rehash a lot of other different movies. But I will say that this film is still enjoyable in the fact that it still has some very unique kills. One of them of which is like this guy's head's cut off and made into like a pumpkin. Like, I thought that was pretty cool. The music's really good. Some of the cinematography is really good, but it's not necessarily a movie I would call like the best Halloween sequel of all time. It's just not for me. Venom, yes, I put Venom in my guilty pleasures list. This is because I actually kind of find myself enjoying it every time I put it in and watching it. It's bad, right? It's considerably bad. It's the worst superhero film of the year, like the worst Spider-Man film since Spider-Man 3. But when it comes down to it, there's a lot of factors I actually like about the film. I like the way Venom actually, like, the symbiote itself attaches to people and, like, morphs with the people. I thought that was pretty neat. Tom Hardy does give a shit in this film, so that his performance is probably the best part of the film. And I like the whole dynamic between Venom and Eddie Brock in this film, being that they're like an old married couple, that they're always bickering with each other. I thought that was hilarious, and it's a different angle than what I'm used to for the character of Venom. But as for the story itself, the plot progression is very weak, considering the fact that the movie starts off with this really great opening, and then it goes 6 months later, and I'm like, okay, why? I don't understand the need for that 6 month time gap. And this is the same guy who did Zombieland and Zombieland 2. I really enjoyed Zombieland, and I feel like if this film had gone the way of a rated R movie, I think I think Ruben Fleischer could have done a really bang up job with the actual character of Venom and made it so like better than what it is. And aside from that, you get Eminem on the soundtrack doing, Venom, Venom, Venom. It's like, no. Just settle the fuck down. This isn't the 90s, all right? And that's kind of the best thing I can actually say for it, is that the film feels like a 90s film. It's a 90s film with flair, and it's unabashedly that. And I feel like there can be a good sense of fun in it. It's not perfect, as I said before. It's still considerably bad, considering the fact that even the villain doesn't even make sense. The villain's color palette is just like metallic gray, and I'm like, you could have done something better. Like, they, between Riot and Venom, they looked pretty much the same for me, like in terms of color grading and color tone. It's just, I don't know, I could barely tell the two apart, and the ending just kind of felt weird, honestly. But I'm excited to see if they ever do a Venom 2, like if they will actually do Carnage correctly, which I don't think they can, but it'll be interesting nonetheless.
What's behind that wall? What do you do with those people? They have been given a purpose.
Overlord is on my list for guilty pleasures because it's not good, but it's not bad either. I really love zombie movies. I love Nazi zombies. I love playing Black Ops Zombies in my spare time, and it's one of my favorite game modes ever to play in the original Black Ops. And when it comes down to this, it's not necessarily what I was hoping for, but I do love the way it builds up the atmosphere at the very beginning. Like, the whole thing with the title card at the beginning feels like a 1950s pulp film. Like the whole, like the texture fonts, the way the title card appears, it's just something that reminds me of a classic Hollywood monster film. And then when we actually get into it, the film kind of takes a nosedive because throughout most of the second act of this film, it doesn't feel like it's building to zombies. It feels like it's just another like generic World War II war film. But then towards the middle of the second act, towards the latter half of the second act, we get more into the actual zombie stuff. And there's some really fun stuff with the zombies, honestly. I wish there could have been a bit more to do with the zombies, honestly. I think if there was more zombies than there were, I think it would have been a really fun sort of like survival film for these for these soldiers. You know, imagine that. You know, Night of the Living Dead with World War II, but with more zombies that are actually able to attack the victims with more effectiveness than what they did in the George Romero movie. I think it would have been a much better outing, for me at least. But I still enjoy it. It's not a terrible film. It's still one of those films I have some enjoyment for.
I'll be your God. What else do we need? I'll be your God if you look after me.
Tommy Wiseau and Greg Sestero have always been kind of the butt of the joke when it comes to a lot of so bad it's good movies, and how can I blame them? They made The Room, for God's sake. And this year, with the Fathom Event sort of series on Best Friends Volume 1 and 2, I went in expecting something, well, bad, honestly. But I came out with some enjoyment. There is some very questionable filmmaking choices in this. Like, there's a lot of frame rate dips, there's a lot of weird color corrections and just desaturation and oversaturations, random insert cuts. And this is just Greg Sestero's own version of a pretentious film. And for me, that's kind of what makes it a little bit funny, that he thinks he's this like smart, you know, thinking outside the box, but it's clear to me that it's just another excuse for Greg Sestero and Tommy Wiseau to come back together and make another movie. And for that, I kind of find some enjoyment in that. You know, just seeing these two work off each other, it's not, you know, Oscar gold or anything, but it's still kind of fun to watch. It's like old friends coming back together, and not like the Adam Sandler way where they have to go on vacation just to make another movie. It's that type of movie, that type of two-part movie that I feel is so funny. Like, the film is not well made. There's a lot of like really flat like television type shots, but then there's like shots that look very cinematic, and it's this sort of inconsistent incongruity that makes the film a little bit hilarious to watch, just to see some of the stupid decisions that are made in this film. But aside from that, you know, it does have this sort of theme of friendship, and that's I guess okay, but in all actuality, I still find myself loving it every single day that I keep watching it. It's hilarious. It's a dumb, over the top, goofy movie, not as well executed as The Room, but it still is one of those guilty pleasure films that I can certainly say is one of my favorites.
Are you a team player or aren't you?
I just chugged a 40 with my asshole. I'm a team player.
And last on the list is a comedy called Blockers. Now, I've kind of fallen out of love with teen sex comedies. I really don't appreciate those anymore. Like, my dad used to be really into American Pie. I was not. American Pie has not really been my thing for decades now. But this one, you know, while it does have that sort of, you know, sex comedy vibe, I feel like there was a little bit more effort in this movie to give it a bit more heart. And I think that's why it's more of a guilty pleasure, is that I'm not a big fan of these sex comedies, but it actually tries to do something better and something special, like actually have a conversation about what they're about to do, like these teenage girls who want to have this sex night on prom night. And, you know, it's these parents that are really concerned about their kids. And there's a nice moment in the third act conclusion that is just like, oh yeah, well, these kids, we can't really control them for much longer, but you know what? Let's just try to console them, you know, because all throughout the movie, the parents are just like, I don't know what even we're gonna do when we get there. Some characters are like, well, I'm gonna fucking like barge in on that boy trying to pound my girl, and I'm gonna beat his shit in. And then you have other characters that are like, well, they're just trying to explore their body. It's like there's certain characters. I think it gives more of a consideration to the discussion of teenage sex, and I think that is what they were going for with this film. But it's not necessarily the most perfect. Some characters are really, really stupid. I really don't like one of the fathers in this film. Not John Cena, but the other father character. Don't know what his name was. But he just wasn't for me. I felt like the girls that were acting as the daughters of these characters, of the parents, actually did a pretty decent job and actually had some scenes where it was kind of emotional. It's not perfect. A lot of the comedy is either you love it or you hate it. It's that type of comedy that's like it's kind of based on your subjective opinion. And for me, sex comedies have kind of gone away from me. Like it's just not my thing anymore. But I can give credit where credit is due. It did try to do something unique and actually try to discuss some of the implications of doing these sex comedies and having sex before you're ready. And I think that's some praise to give this film. But it's just not perfect. It's a guilty pleasure to watch because I like the characters. I like some of the stuff that happens in the film. But it's a guilty pleasure even if it is kind of a low point for me. And that is all of the guilty pleasures of 2018. What have been some of your guilty pleasures? Comment down below whether or not you agree with me. Comment down below if you have a film that you think is a guilty pleasure that I didn't put on this list. And so I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.